The letter was not supposed to be read aloud. Penelope Ashworth had understood that from the moment she found it tucked behind her father's copy of Blackstone's Commentaries, 3 days after the funeral, when the solicitor's clerk had finished reading the official testament and left her with nothing but debts and a rented house she could not afford past the quarter. The letter was personal. It was her father's handwriting, careful, methodical, the same hand that had marked account margins and corrected her arithmetic when she was 8 years old, and it was addressed to her by name, not to any creditor or executor or heir. She had read it 4 times alone in the cold parlor before she folded it and put it away. She had not intended to take it out again in public, but that was before she understood what was at stake. Before she sat in the long, narrow room of Chalcott House on a gray October afternoon in 1817, surrounded by men who had been speaking for 40 minutes about her father's estate, as though she were a lampstand, and heard the solicitor named Greaves read aloud from a document she had never seen, which described her father's final investment in terms that made him sound reckless, negligent, possibly fraudulent, and which would, if accepted, result in the seizure of the last £1,100 held in trust for Penelope's maintenance and the settlement of his remaining honest debts. She held the letter through all of it, both hands in her lap, the folded paper pressed flat between her palms, exactly the way she had learned not to press her hands together in that room when the men were speaking, because it looked like supplication. And at the edge of that long, narrow room, seated at the far end of the table where no one had offered her a chair and so she had simply taken one, was Penelope Ashworth, 26 years old, dressed in the last serviceable gown she owned, holding a letter that was about to change everything. The Duke of Arranmore was at the other end of the table. He had not spoken yet. He had arrived late, which Penelope had not expected. She had been told he would not attend in person, that his estate's investment stake in the Ashworth trading accounts would be represented by a man named Fordham, but the Duke had walked in 12 minutes into Greaves' reading and taken the chair at the head of the table as though it had been left for him specifically. He wore a dark tailcoat and no ornamentation. He did not look at anyone when he sat down. He looked at the table, then at the papers in front of him, and he had not looked away from them since. He was, Penelope observed, the only person in the room who appeared to be actually reading the documents, rather than performing the act of reading them. She unfolded the letter. The room did not notice immediately. There was a long suspended moment, and then the solicitor Greaves paused mid-sentence because Penelope had begun to read aloud, and her voice was level, and she did not stop. Her father had written his letter in October of 1814, 3 years before his death, during a period Penelope now understood to be the beginning of his illness, before the tremors made writing difficult. He had addressed it to her directly. He had described in his careful, methodical hand the exact nature of the speculative investment he had made in the Arranmore wool trading accounts, the terms under which he had entered the arrangement, the date of the agreement, the name of the man who had countersigned on the Duke's behalf, and, this was the part that made Greaves stop and put his pen down, the specific clause that had been removed from the final document without her father's knowledge or consent. Penelope read that part twice. She did not look up from the paper. She did not raise her voice. The Duke of Arranmore went pale. She had been running her father's household accounts since she was 19 years old, and she had been running them alone since she was 22. That was the year her father's hands had begun to shake badly enough that the quarterly reconciliations took twice as long and required her to sit beside him and transcribe what he dictated, then verify the figures herself before they were sent to creditors. She had not minded the work. She had minded the invisibility of it, the way creditors addressed their letters to her father even as they negotiated rates with her, the way the factor who managed the small Ashworth property in Wiltshire spoke past her in every quarterly meeting, looking over her shoulder for the man of the house who was seated in the next room and could not hold a pen. She had learned to stop minding, Or rather, she had learned to convert the energy of minding into something more useful, which was precision. By the time her father died in July of 1817, Penelope had a complete record of 7 years of Ashworth accounts. Every creditor, every outstanding amount, every agreement, every schedule of payment, every letter she had written in her father's name, with his permission, always, but in his name nonetheless, because the creditors would not deal with her in her own. She kept the records in a set of 4 ledgers, bound in brown cloth, stored in the flat-topped chest in the morning room. The ledgers were not elegant. They were dense with figures and margin notations and cross-references. She had developed her own system of annotation over 7 years, a shorthand that allowed her to trace any single figure back to its original agreement across multiple years. It was not a system she had been taught. She had made it because she needed it. When the solicitor had finished reading the official testament that left her almost nothing, she had thanked him politely, shown him out, and gone back to the morning room and opened the ledgers to the section marked Aaronmore, Trading Accounts, entered 1812. Her father had invested £620 in the Aaronmore wool trading venture 5 years before his death. It was his largest single investment, and it was the only one he had made without consulting her. She had been in Bristol visiting her mother's cousin during the month the agreement was signed, and by the time she returned, the papers were already filed. She had asked him about it once, cautiously, and he had said the terms were sound and that the Duke of Aaronmore's estate manager, a man named Colston, had offered very particular assurances about the yield schedule. He had seemed satisfied. She had noted the investment in the ledger and continued. Now, reading back through the correspondence she had transcribed for her father over the following years, she found the shape of what had happened. The yield schedule had not performed as promised. When her father had raised the shortfall in writing, a letter Penelope had drafted herself, precise and not unkind, the response from Colston had revised the original terms of the agreement, referencing clauses her father had apparently signed that bore no resemblance to what he had described to her. She had noted the discrepancy in the margin at the time. She had written Clause 7 disputed, see original, and drawn a line to the blank space where she had expected to file a copy of the original signed document. There was no copy. Her father had not kept one. This was the moment, she thought now, sitting in the cold parlor, reading by the last of the evening light, when a different woman might have wept, or set the ledgers aside, or decided that the loss was simply the loss, and nothing could be done. The world had arranged itself specifically to make that conclusion feel reasonable. She had no copy of the original agreement. Her father was dead. She was 26 and unmarried, and had no legal standing in any room where these matters were decided. She picked up her pen and began to write. The letter she found behind the Blackstone took 3 more days to surface in her memory as relevant. She had set it aside because it was personal, because it was her father's voice in handwriting, because it had not occurred to her immediately that it was also a legal document, or at least that it contained the specific factual account of what the original agreement had said, written in her father's hand, on a dated page, before the illness had taken the precision from his writing, but not from his mind. He had written it for her. She understood, reading it again in the cold parlor with the ledgers open beside her, that he had known this might happen. He had known, and he had done what he could. She had managed 7 years of accounts under impossible constraints. She could manage this. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. Penelope Ashworth had been keeping rooms standing for a long time, and not one of them had been hers. The letter had been in her coat pocket for 11 days before she took it to Chalcott House. She had spent those 11 days preparing. She returned to the ledgers and extracted every notation she had made across 5 years that related to the Aaronmore accounts, 14 references in total, each cross-indexed to a specific piece of correspondence. She had arranged them chronologically in a thin portfolio and written a single page of summary at the front, which stated in plain, complete sentences what the original terms had been, what the revised terms had claimed, where the revision had created a material discrepancy, and what the financial consequence of that discrepancy had been to the Ashworth estate over 5 years. She did not use the word fraud in the summary page. She used the word discrepancy, and she used it 6 times, each time with a figure attached. She had also gone on the 7th day to see a man named Edward Finch, a retired solicitor who had been her father's friend for 30 years and had no financial stake in the Aaronmore accounts. He was 71 and suffered from gout and received her in his morning room wearing a wool dressing gown, which she did not comment on. She showed him the portfolio. He read it without speaking for 18 minutes. When he was done, he looked at her over his reading glasses and said, "Your father was a careful man." "He was," Penelope said. "I helped him." Finch looked at her with the particular stillness of someone who has just recalibrated an assumption. Then he said, "I know a man on the investment council. I can arrange that you be permitted to attend the Chalcott meeting. I cannot arrange that they will listen to you." "I will manage the listening," Penelope said. Finch had provided one additional thing. He had, through his contact on the council, obtained a copy of the filed version of the 1812 Aaronmore investment agreement, the document that Greaves had relied upon, the one with the altered clause. She added it to the portfolio. She placed it beside her father's letter, so that anyone who wished to compare them could do so with no assistance from her. When she walked into Chalcott House on that gray October afternoon, she carried the portfolio under her arm, the letter in her coat pocket, and the 7 years of invisible labor in her hands. No one offered her a chair. She took one. She had not, even then, known the Duke of Aaronmore would attend in person. She had known very little about him, in fact. His estate was in the north. He had a reputation for being exacting and private, and largely absent from London society. He had been a duke for 11 years, inheriting at 22 when his father died, and he had spent the first 8 of those years reportedly managing a significant estate debt that his father had accumulated and his own income had eventually resolved. He had not, in her research, appeared to be a man who involved himself in the precise management of every account attached to his estate. She had assumed Colston was his own man, working at his own latitude. She had not assumed the Duke would arrive and sit quietly and read the documents as though he intended to actually understand them. He was reading the filed version of the 1812 agreement when she began to read the letter aloud. She could tell, because his eyes were at the wrong position on the page for the section Greaves had been reading, which meant he had gone back to the beginning. She did not know what that signified. She knew that he had gone pale when she reached the passage about the removed clause, and that he had not looked up from the document since, and that his jaw had the set of a man who has discovered something he considers a structural failure, and that this was, in fact, useful. She finished reading the letter. She folded it and set it on the table. She placed the portfolio in front of her, opened it to the summary page, and said to the room in a clear and level voice that she had additional documentation she wished to present, and that she would require perhaps 15 minutes of the council's attention, and that she believed they would find the figures straightforward. No one spoke for a moment. Then the Duke of Aaronmore said, "Continue." He said it to the room, but he was looking at her. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. She did not count on it now. She opened the portfolio to the first cross-referenced notation and began. What followed in the days after the Chalcott meeting was not simple. Penelope had not expected it to be. She had expected, at best, that the council would agree to review the discrepancy before rendering a final decision on the estate's claims, and that was precisely what happened, which she counted as sufficient. The meeting had lasted another 40 minutes after she finished presenting. Greaves had objected twice, The council had overruled him once and deferred the other point for review. The Duke of Arranmore had said almost nothing, but at 2 separate moments he had asked Greaves to read a specific clause of the filed document aloud, and both times the clause, heard in its entirety rather than summarized, had supported Penelope's account of the discrepancy. She had returned to her rented house and put the portfolio away and sat for a long time in the morning room before she could eat. The invitation came 4 days later. It was from the Duke of Arranmore's estate secretary, and it requested, in formal and precise language, that Miss Ashworth attend a meeting at Arranmore's London residence, Cartley House, at 11 o'clock on the following Thursday, regarding the ongoing review of the investment accounts. It specified that she should bring any documentation she considered relevant. It was signed by the secretary, but at the bottom, in different and slightly uneven handwriting, someone had added, "Your father's letter should also be brought." She turned the card over. There was nothing on the back. She set it on the morning room table and went to find a clean copy of the portfolio. Cartley House was in the north part of Mayfair, a large white-faced building that said nothing about itself from the outside, which Penelope found she respected. She was shown in by a young footman who appeared to know exactly who she was and exactly where she was going, and taken to a room on the first floor that was clearly a working library. Shelves of ledgers and bound correspondence alongside books, a desk with papers on it, 2 windows overlooking a gray garden, rather than the formal drawing room she had prepared herself for. A woman near the fire, perhaps 40, with a direct expression and no interest in performing welcome, looked up when Penelope entered and said, "You'll be Miss Ashworth. I'm Mrs. Heaton. I run the household. His Grace will be another 10 minutes. Sit wherever you find useful." This was how Penelope met the person in the new world who offered her the first genuine welcome, without ceremony, without performance, without any of the social calculation she had braced for. She chose the chair nearest the writing table and took out the portfolio and was reviewing her cross-references when the Duke arrived. He was taller than she had registered in the dim, narrow room at Chalcot House. He moved through the library without looking at anything except where he intended to sit, which was the chair behind the writing table, directly across from her. He had a document in his hand. He set it on the table between them and said, without preamble, "I have dismissed Colston." Penelope said, "I see." She waited. "The original agreement," he said, "was filed with a revised clause. I have now confirmed this through my own solicitor, independent of the Chalcot Review. The revision was made after my father signed the original, my father, not I, and it was made without the knowledge of either the Ashworth party or my own estate office. My father died 8 years ago. Colston had been in place since before my tenure." He paused. "I am telling you this so that you understand the scope of what I am correcting." "I understand," Penelope said. "My father also died without knowing the full scope of it." The Duke looked at her then, directly, for the first time in this room. It was not the measuring attention she had felt from the far end of the Chalcot table. It was something less categorizable, like a stone dropped into still water, she thought. Not violent, but with consequence. "How long did you manage the accounts?" he said. 7 years, she said. "The active management began in 1810. My father's health declined from 1812. By 1814 I was conducting all correspondence." In his name, she agreed. "The creditors would not deal with me in my own." He looked at the portfolio. He said, "May I?" It was not quite a question. She pushed it across the table. He read. She had brought her 3rd cup of tea by the time he finished, Mrs. Heaton having appeared twice without being asked, which was the kind of domestic attentiveness that felt, in a house this size, like a deliberate choice rather than standard service. Penelope did not look at the Duke while he read. She looked at the garden through the window, which had a dormant rose bed and a path that curved out of sight between two hedges and looked as though it had been laid out by someone who intended to walk it regularly and perhaps no longer did. When he set the portfolio down, he said, "The summary page is yours." "Yes," she said. "Not transcribed from your father's dictation." "No, he could not have produced that format. The cross-referencing system is mine. I developed it over the first 3 years when I needed to locate figures quickly across multiple ledgers." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Chalcott Council will meet again in 3 weeks. There will be restitution for the discrepancy. The amount will be returned to the Ashworth estate in full, with the addition of the yield differential, calculated across 5 years. He set his hands flat on the table, a precise gesture, like a well-built bridge bearing its weight. "That is not what I asked you here to discuss." Penelope set down her cup. "What did you ask me here to discuss?" "I have an estate in Yorkshire," he said. 7,000 acres. The house accounts have been inadequately managed since before I inherited. My father employed a system that was functional for his purposes and inadequate for the scale we operate at now. I have been looking for someone who can reconstruct the accounts across a 10-year period and establish a workable forward system. He looked at her with careful attention. "I believe you are qualified." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the cold parlor and the ledgers and the 7 years of invisible labor, and she thought about what she had understood in the morning room after the Chalcott meeting, that she had done the thing she set out to do, that there was no next step she could see from here, that the rented house would become unmanageable by February, and that no one in her world was going to offer her work that used what she actually knew how to do. She said, "I am not a housekeeper, Your Grace, and I am not a secretary." "No," he said, "I am proposing the role of estate accounts manager, with a formal contract, a separate stipend, and authority to communicate directly with the estate's solicitor and creditors under your own name." A pause. "Those are the terms I intend to offer. You may negotiate them." Penelope said, "I will want to see the existing accounts before I agree to anything." He said, "That is a reasonable condition." She said, "I will also want the authority in writing, signed and witnessed, before I begin any substantive work." He said, "Also reasonable." She picked up her portfolio and stood. "I will come to Yorkshire to see the accounts. If the scope is what you describe, and the contract terms are acceptable, I will consider the offer." He rose when she rose. He said, "The house is large. My staff will ensure you are appropriately accommodated." "I don't require much," she said. It was not a complaint. It was simply accurate. He said, "I know," and then quietly, as though he had not quite intended to say it aloud, "My father made poor choices in people and in agreements both. I have tried to be more careful. I did not know about Colston until 3 days ago, which I consider a failure of my own attention. He was not asking for absolution. He was stating a fact about himself, with the particular stillness of someone who does not excuse himself as a general policy." Penelope said, "My father trusted a man he should not have trusted. I reviewed his correspondence for 7 years, and I missed it too, until I read his letter again with the filed document beside it." She looked at him steadily. "Sometimes the gap is only visible from a particular angle. That does not make either of us careless." She left Cartley House at 12:30. She walked the first 2 streets rather than hailing a hackney, because she needed the cold air and the movement and the sense of the ground under her feet. She had not counted on this. She had not planned beyond the Chalcott meeting, and now there was a contract offer and a journey to Yorkshire, and a set of accounts covering 10 years that no one had reconciled properly, and she felt something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but something older and heavier than either, the feeling of being in the right place at the right time, not by luck, but because she had prepared. Yorkshire in November was gray and cold and very large. Penelope had been on the post road for 2 days before the carriage turned through the gates of Arranmore Hall, and she saw the house properly for the first time. A long, low stone building with wings extending on both sides, older than she had expected, with the particular solidity of a place that had not been renovated for show. The grounds were extensive and visible from the drive, tenant farms in the distance, a mill building near the eastern hedge, a walled garden off to the north that looked orderly from the outside, which she noted as a point of contrast to what she suspected she would find in the accounts. She was received by the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Crane, who was 60 and exact, and welcomed her with professional courtesy, and showed her to a room in the east wing that had a writing table by the window and a fire already lit. There was a young housemaid called Jane who appeared within 5 minutes of Penelope's arrival and asked, with genuine interest rather than scripted inquiry, whether Miss Ashworth would prefer her tea strong or weak. Penelope said strong, and Jane brought it strong, and that was the beginning of a domestic alliance built on precision and mutual respect that would outlast the winter. The accounts were worse than she had expected. They were not fraudulent. Unlike the Chalcott situation, there was no conspiracy in the Arranmore household ledgers, only the accumulated disorder of a system that had been stretched past its capacity without being fundamentally redesigned. The estate had grown in the 11 years since the Duke inherited. The income streams were more numerous and more complex than the recording system could accommodate. The result was a set of books in which figures were accurate individually, but could not be read as a whole. Each ledger told its own story, and no one had written the story that connected them. She began at the beginning, the year 1807, the first full year of the current Duke's tenure, when he had been 22, and the estate debt was already significant. She started a new ledger and worked forward, methodically, cross-referencing each source ledger to her own annotations, the way she had learned to do in the Ashworth morning room. It was slow work. It was the kind of work that required long, unbroken stretches of attention, which the estate, to her relief, provided. She worked from 7 in the morning until the light failed, which in November in Yorkshire was not long, and so she worked by lamplight until 8 in the evening, and then she ate and went to bed. On the 4th day, the Duke arrived. She had not known when to expect him. The invitation to Yorkshire had come from the estate secretary, and she had assumed there would be some overlap in residence but had not confirmed it. He came into the estate office, the room she was using, off the main corridor, which had the 10-year ledgers stacked in chronological order, and her own new ledger open in the center, and her annotation portfolio beside it, without knocking, which she noted, and then stopped in the doorway and looked at the table and said nothing for a moment. "You've organized them by year," he said. "By year and cross-indexed to the tenancy agreements," she said, without looking up. "Your tenancy records are in a separate archive in the steward's room, which creates an obvious problem. I'll need to work with both sets simultaneously. I would prefer to consolidate the tenancy files into this room for the duration. I'll tell Graves," he said. Graves was the estate steward, a man of middle age and visible uncertainty about Penelope's presence, who had not precisely opposed her but had also not provided any assistance she had not specifically requested. She looked up then. He was still in the doorway, his coat carrying the cold of the outside, which meant he had come directly in. "There is a discrepancy in the 1811 wool accounts," she said. 4 entries in March that do not reconcile with the corresponding tenancy payments. I wanted to flag it before I proceed." He came fully into the room and looked at what she had open. She moved the annotation portfolio so he could see the cross-reference. He read it with his hands behind his back, bent slightly at the waist, with the close attention she had noticed at Chalcott. He said, "I remember this. The Hartley farm had a partial yield that year. Late frost. There should be a letter from the factor explaining the adjustment." "There is a letter," she said. "It does not explain the adjustment. It references the adjustment but does not document the arithmetic. He said, the arithmetic was done verbally. At the time, he straightened. I was 26 and I was managing a debt inherited from my father and 3 disputed tenancy renewals simultaneously. I did not record everything I should have. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who recognizes a fault not from malice but from overextension. I can reconstruct the arithmetic from the yield records and the payment records if they exist. Do the yield records survive from 1811? The steward's archive has them to 1809. Before that, my father's system. I'll look, she said, and she made a note. He did not leave immediately. He looked at the stacked ledgers, then at the new ledger she had opened, then at the window, which showed the gray garden and the walled section off to the north. He said, without particular inflection, my mother planted the walled garden. She died when I was 14. I haven't altered it. She had not asked. She filed the information with the same care she gave every piece of information, because it told her something about the weight he had been carrying in this house for a long time. She said, it's visible from the drive. It looks orderly. She was orderly, he said. He left it there. She picked up her pen and returned to the ledger. She heard him move to the door, and then pause, and she said without looking up, your cravat has been crooked since you came in. If you have a meeting with anyone this afternoon, you'll want to correct it before then. There was a silence. She did not look up. She heard him make an adjustment, and then he said, I have had it crooked for how long? Since before breakfast, I expect, she said. I saw you cross the courtyard from the window at 8:30. He said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, almost to himself, 40 minutes then, and he left. She heard, a moment later, something that might have been a laugh, very brief and very private, and already gone by the time she looked up. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm, which she had not anticipated, and which felt, after a time, like the rhythm of a place where she actually belonged. She worked in the estate office. The Duke was in residence more than she had expected. He managed the estate actively, she realized, not from a distance but from within it, and he had opinions about the accounts that were based on real knowledge of the operations, which made the reconstruction work faster than it would have been with an absentee owner. They developed a practice of meeting in the library in the late afternoon, when the light from the estate office had failed and the library had better lamps, and she would bring the new ledger and he would provide context for the entries she had flagged, and they would work through the figures together, with a kind of parallel concentration that felt, she thought, like weather coming in, something that changed the air around them without arriving all at once. There was the afternoon she found the pattern in the 1814 wool accounts that explained a persistent 200-pound discrepancy that had confounded her for a week, a factor payment that had been recorded in the wrong year, compounded by an interest calculation applied at the wrong rate. She had traced it through 4 separate ledgers and confirmed it 3 times before she was certain, and when she brought it to him in the library, she spread the 4 ledgers open on the table and walked him through the chain of errors precisely, and he listened without interrupting and then said, the interest rate was changed in March of 1814. I changed it. I told the factor. Evidently the ledger entry was not corrected. He looked at the chain of notations she had built. He said, this will take you some time to unwind. 6 hours, she said. Perhaps 8, if the corresponding wool merchant records are as incomplete as I expect. He looked at her then with the expression she had begun to recognize, not the measuring attention from the early meetings, but something that had settled into a different shape, like armor no longer needed but still being worn from habit. He said, you find this satisfying. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. Yes, she said, I find discrepancies satisfying to resolve. It is like a translation, 2 accounts describing the same event in different terms, and the gap between them is where the error lives. Most people, he said, find gaps uncomfortable. Most people have not spent 7 years looking for them. She closed the outer ledgers and kept the central one open. I should finish this section tonight while the chain of it is clear in my head. He said, "Have you eaten today?" She thought about it. Breakfast. He said nothing. He simply went to the door and spoke to someone in the corridor, and 20 minutes later Jane arrived with a tray that included more food than Penelope had consumed in a full day since arriving at Arranmore Hall, and she ate without stopping work, and the Duke returned to his own correspondence at the other end of the library, without commenting on either of these facts. It was not kindness, she told herself. It was the practical maintenance of a valued resource. She was not going to read anything further into it than that. She read further into it than that approximately 8 days later, when she was working in the estate office at 9:30 in the evening and heard footsteps in the corridor outside the door, slow, deliberate, not going anywhere. And when she opened the door to check, found the Duke standing in the corridor with a lamp and a book he was clearly not reading. He had been there, she estimated from the position of the lamp on the wall, for at least 30 minutes. "You were outside the door," she said. "I was reading," he said. "You were standing still," she said. "And the page was the same as when I last heard you shift your position, which was 11 minutes ago." He looked at her. Then he looked at the book, which was open at a page of Cowper, and closed it. He said, "I thought you might need the lamp when you finished. The corridor is dark." She looked at the lamp. She looked at him. She said, "Thank you." And she meant it as the precisely weighted thing it was, not a social noise but an acknowledgement of a fact she had not known how to process, that someone had stood outside a closed door for 30 minutes to make sure she had light to walk back by. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like kindness, but she thought this was the real thing, and she thought it carefully and did not set it aside. She had not been without opposition in the house. Graves, the estate steward, had grown less uncertain as the weeks passed, but had not grown warm. He had twice routed correspondence to himself that she considered within her purview, and she had twice redirected it with a note that explained her authority under the contract's terms, with specific reference to the relevant clause. The third time he did not test it. She also received, in the 3rd week of November, a call from a woman named Lady Frances Montrose, who had evidently been a regular guest at Arranmore Hall for some years, and who arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with a companion and a very clear intention to assess the situation. Penelope met her in the drawing room because Mrs. Crane had quietly suggested it was expected, and she sat in the chair nearest the window and listened to Lady Frances explain, with a particular kind of precision that came dressed as social conversation, that the Duke had long been expected to marry appropriately, that the families of the county had a mutual investment in the stability of the Arranmore estate, and that any, she paused here, selecting her word, arrangement that created an ambiguity in the household's professional structure might be considered disruptive to those expectations. Penelope said, "I am the estate accounts manager, Lady Frances. The contract is documented and filed with the estate solicitor. I believe the professional structure is quite clear." Lady Frances looked at her with the expression of a woman who had won every room she had ever entered by the simple force of being certain she would. She said, "I am sure it is, on paper." Penelope said, "The accounts have recovered £240 in margin errors in the first 6 weeks of the reconstruction. I expect the final figure to be considerably higher when I complete the analysis. I imagine that is of interest to anyone with a stake in the estate's financial stability." She smiled briefly, the way she had learned to smile in rooms where smiling was safer than accuracy, and she stood. "It has been very pleasant. I'll let Mrs. Crane know you called." Lady Frances was not destroyed by this. She was simply, like a piece of furniture moved to the wrong room, no longer able to function as intended. She left 40 minutes later with her companion and her certain expression intact, and Penelope returned to the estate office and did not think about it further. She thought about it slightly further at dinner, which she now ate in the dining room rather than the estate office, because the Duke had said, in the second week, that it was impractical for her to work through meals, and the dining room was there, and she had pointed out that she preferred working through meals, and he had said he was not particularly interested in eating alone, and she had considered this and agreed. It was at dinner that she told him, in spare factual terms, about Lady Frances's visit, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Frances has been visiting this estate since I was 12 years old. She has an idea of what it should contain." "I know," Penelope said. She made it clear. He set down his fork. He said, "I am not going to ask you to manage her expectations. That is not part of your contract." "No," she said, "but it is part of the reality of the work. I am not unused to managing realities." She looked at him. "Did you know she would come?" He said, "I expected she would." He picked up his fork again. "I expected it would not change anything." She looked at him with something she could not name and did not try to, and she returned to her meal, and the fire in the dining room grate cracked and settled, and neither of them said anything further about Lady Frances. Penelope had been at Arranmore Hall for 6 weeks when she found the systematic problem. It was not the 1814 discrepancy, which she had resolved. It was something older, a pattern in the pre-tenure accounts, from 1803 through 1806, when the previous Duke had been managing a private investment arrangement that intersected with the estate accounts in a way that had been recorded as a single consolidated figure each year. The figure was not wrong, but it obscured what it represented, and what it represented was a set of agreements. She counted them carefully, 29 of the 37 she could identify, that had been made with wool merchants in the West Riding under terms that were now structured to her disadvantage. The estate was still paying out against those terms. The amounts were not large individually. Across all 29 agreements, they amounted to approximately £400 annually in margin paid to merchants who were providing no current service in exchange. She wrote it up. She took 3 days to verify it, because she wanted to be certain. She cross-indexed every agreement she could identify, used the tenancy records for the years in question to validate the transaction dates, and wrote a clear 2-page analysis with a recommendation. The agreements should be formally reviewed by the estate solicitor and renegotiated or dissolved, and the £400 annually could be recovered into the estate's operating margin. She brought it to him in the library. It was evening. He read it twice, and she watched him read it, and she saw the moment he understood the scope of it. His jaw settled, and his hands went flat on the table, and he looked at the figure at the bottom of the second page for a long time. He said, "These agreements have been in place since 1803. 14 years, she said. The previous system couldn't read them as a pattern because they were recorded as consolidated figures. They only become visible when you run them against the merchant records separately." He said, "My father negotiated these." "Yes." He was quiet. She understood what he was doing, the same thing she had done in the Ashworth morning room when she understood the scope of the Colston discrepancy, holding the knowledge steady before deciding how to act. She waited. He said, "I want this in front of the estate solicitor by the end of the month. Can you prepare a version suitable for his review?" "I'll have it by Thursday," she said. He looked at her then. She had the impression that he had been wanting to look at her for some time, and had been deciding when it was appropriate. He said, "You have done more in 6 weeks than this estate has had done in 10 years. She said, "The accounts were ready to be read. They needed someone who could read them." He said, "That is not an ordinary thing to be able to do." She said, "I know. It was not vanity. It was simply accurate." She had known for a long time that the skill she had was real, and that it was being wasted, and she had also known that the waste was not hers to correct alone. She had done what she could, where she was, with what she had. This was the first time the situation had arranged itself to allow her to do it fully. He said, "Penelope." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it like a stone dropped into still water, not violent with consequence. He said, "I should have come to find you sooner." She said, "You did not know I existed." "No," he said, "but I should have been paying better attention to what did." She held that. She set it in the place she kept things she intended to think about properly, and she stood and closed the 2-page analysis and said good night, and she was at the door before she turned and said, "Your mother's walled garden, does anyone maintain it?" He said, "A gardener goes in once a year." She said, "It's winter, I won't disturb anything, but I would like to walk in it if I may. It looks like it was designed for walking." He said, "It was." A pause. She walked there every morning, before breakfast when the weather allowed. "Then I'll go in the morning," Penelope said, "before the light goes." He said nothing. He simply looked at her with an expression she had no word for, and which she thought, privately, might be something she had also never felt before, though she was going to take her time arriving at that conclusion. She walked in the walled garden for the next 7 mornings, and on the 8th morning he was there before her, standing on the stone path with no coat and his breath making small clouds in the cold air, looking at the dormant rose bed as though trying to remember something. She came through the gate and he looked up and did not leave. They walked the path in the same direction without speaking, and at the far corner where the path curved back toward the gate, he said, "She would have liked you." Penelope said, "I think I would have liked her." He said, "She was competent." Quietly. Nobody acknowledged it. She said, "I know the shape of that." He said, "Yes." They walked the rest of the path back to the gate, and there he said, "The solicitors' meeting is on Friday. I want you in the room." "I intended to be," she said. She heard him, again, make a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to one, and she went inside to put on dry shoes and get to work. The letter from the Investment Council arrived on a Wednesday in December. It was addressed to the Duke of Arranmore, but he brought it to the estate office unopened and set it on her table. She opened it. The Chalcott Review had concluded. The council had accepted the full account of the discrepancy, the original agreement terms as described in her father's letter, cross-referenced against the filed document, validated against the Ashworth correspondence she had supplied. The restitution figure was £1,140, the original discrepancy, plus the 5-year yield differential, calculated at the rate her father had agreed to and documented in his letter. She set the letter down. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table. He was watching her. He said, "Is it sufficient?" She said, "It is exact, which is what I asked for." He said, "Greaves is contesting the council's authority to compel restitution. He has filed with the court." She said, "I know. Finch told me." She looked at him. "I have to go to London." He said, "I know." He paused. "I am also going to London." She looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who has understood something they were not planning to understand yet. She said, "When?" He said, "The day after tomorrow. There is a winter assembly at the Brentford family. I have been asked to attend." He paused again. "I do not normally attend these things. I have accepted this one." She said nothing. He said, "I want you to come." She said carefully, "I am not the sort of woman one brings to a winter assembly." He said, "No, you are the sort of woman I am choosing to bring to a winter assembly." He looked at her steadily, and she thought of the corridor and the lamp and the 30 minutes he had stood outside a closed door, and she thought of the walled garden path and the morning light and his mother's roses in their winter dormancy, and she thought, "He has already decided. He decided some time ago. He is simply telling her now." She said, "I will need to finish the solicitor's documentation before we leave." He said, "I expect nothing less." The Brentford Winter Assembly was held in a house with more chandeliers than Penelope had ever seen in one room, which was considerable, and with an arranged social architecture of gowns and connections and calibrated smiles that she observed with the same attention she brought to account structures, seeing the pattern beneath the surface, reading where the figures did not reconcile. She was aware from the moment she entered that she was being read. She wore the dress she had brought from London, which was dark blue and serviceable and not fashionable, and she wore her hair in the way she always wore it, and she stood beside the Duke for the first 20 minutes without speaking to anyone and watching the room. Lady Frances was there. She arrived with a group of 3 women and looked at Penelope across the room with an expression that recalibrated itself twice in the space of a breath, and Penelope looked back steadily, and then looked away first, because she had nothing to prove to Lady Frances, and also because she had just seen the man named Greaves in conversation with the Investment Council member Fordham near the far wall, and they were talking with an urgency that felt less like social conversation and more like a strategy being adjusted. She said quietly to the Duke, "Greaves is here." He said, "I see him." She said, "He is speaking to Fordham." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have the full documentation with me, in my portfolio, in the anteroom where we left our things." He looked at her then. He said, "You brought the portfolio." "I bring it everywhere," she said. "I have since October." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "There is going to be a formal presentation of the council's decision tonight. Fordham is on the dais." He paused. "Greaves is going to contest it publicly," she said. "Then I will need to respond publicly." She looked at him. "I am prepared to do that," he said. "I know you are." He said it with a quietness that was not reassurance but recognition. 2 different things, and she was glad he understood the difference. The formal presentation came after the first interval, when the room reassembled around the central floor, and Fordham stood at the raised end and read the council's decision in its official form. The Ashworth investment discrepancy, the restitution figure, the council's finding that the filed document did not reflect the original agreed terms. It was dry and complete, and the room received it with the polite attention of people who were half interested. Greaves contested it before Fordham had finished. He rose from the far side of the room and said in a loud and confident voice that the council had exceeded its authority in compelling restitution, that the original agreement had been legally filed and could not be superseded by a private letter of uncertain provenance, and that he wished to formally challenge the process that had admitted Miss Ashworth's presentation to the council in the first place, as her standing to present was, he said, legally questionable. The room did not erupt. There was a suspended moment, the kind that always precedes a thing shifting. Penelope walked to the front of the room. She did not hurry. She did not look at Greaves. She set her portfolio on the small table beside the dais, opened it, and turned to the room. She said, in her level voice, that she believed the room would benefit from seeing the documentation directly, since the question of the original agreement's terms was being disputed, and that she would take perhaps 10 minutes of their attention. She presented it precisely as she had presented it at Chalcott, not as an argument, but as a translation. The letter, the filed document, the 6 cross-referenced notations from the Ashworth correspondence, the specific clause that had been altered, the 5-year figure. She read the relevant clause of the original agreement aloud from her father's letter, in his handwriting, in the voice she had always used for her father's words, careful and exact. She read the corresponding clause of the filed document. She said simply that the difference was documented, and that the documentation was available for any member of the council to review. The room was quiet. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing, and this room had 30 witnesses, and not one of them looked away. The Duke of Arranmore rose from his chair. He walked to the front of the room, and he stood beside her, and he looked at Fordham and said, in a clear and deliberate voice, that the documentation Miss Ashworth had presented was supported in full by the independent investigation his own solicitor had conducted, that the original agreement had been altered without the knowledge or consent of either party who had signed it, and that the council's decision to compel restitution was correct and would stand. He looked at the room. He said, "Miss Ashworth has managed the Ashworth estate accounts with extraordinary precision for 7 years, without acknowledgement and without any of the legal standing she should have been given. She brought this matter before the council with evidence compiled from those 7 years of invisible labor. She is owed the restitution, and she is owed this room's recognition of what she has done." He turned to her then, and he offered his hand. She looked at it for a moment. She gave him hers. He brought it to his lips with 300 people watching, in the particular way that made it perfectly clear to every person in the room that this was not a social courtesy, but a declaration, and that he intended everyone present to understand the difference. Greaves sat down. He did not speak again. Fordham, who had been watching from the dais with the expression of a man recalibrating several years of assumptions simultaneously, said, after a moment, that the council's decision was confirmed and that the documentation would be entered into the formal record. The room eventually found its voice again, and conversation resumed, and Penelope stood with her portfolio in hand and felt, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, the particular sensation of being in a room that had actually looked at her. Lady Frances passed her on the way to the supper room and did not say anything, but she looked at Penelope with an expression that was not warmth and was not contempt. It was the look of a woman who has understood, finally, that the terms of competition she assumed no longer apply. She moved on. That was sufficient. The Duke's father, his advisor, correctly speaking, since the previous Duke was 10 years dead, was a man named Lord Whitfield, 70 years old, who had managed the Arranmore family's social investments since before Alexander's tenure, and who had made his opposition to the arrangement with Penelope clear in the only way available to him, without openly defying the Duke, which was through 3 separate conversations with the estate solicitor about the unprecedented nature of the contract terms. He had not said anything to Penelope directly. He came to find her the following morning, in the hotel's small writing room where she was updating her notes from the previous night, and he stood in the doorway and looked at the portfolio on the table and the new ledger she had opened for the Yorkshire accounts and said, in a dry and careful voice, "You will not mismanage him." She looked up. She said, "I beg your pardon?" He said, "Alexander, he has been alone in that house for 11 years. He is not," he paused, selecting, "he is not practiced at being seen clearly. He will not always know how to receive it." He looked at her. "You seem to be a person who is practiced at seeing clearly." She said, "I have had some occasion to develop the skill." He said, "I imagine you have." He looked at the ledger. He said, "The £400 annually. I knew about those agreements. I considered them cost of business." She said, "They are recoverable." He said, "Yes, I see that now." He looked at her steadily. He chose well. It was not said with warmth. It was said in the voice of a man who does not revise his positions publicly and has chosen to do so privately instead, which was, Penelope thought, sufficient. He left. She returned to the ledger. The private moment came later that evening, when the hotel was quiet and she was returning from the writing room and found the Duke in the corridor outside her door, not standing this time but walking toward her, which was different, and which meant he had come specifically rather than lingered. He stopped when he saw her. They looked at each other for a moment in the corridor with the lamp between them. He said, "I owe you a proposal." She said, "You owe me no such thing." He said, "Not from obligation. That is exactly the opposite of what I mean." He looked at her with the expression she had no word for, and had stopped trying to name. He said, not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted to the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the only person I have met in 11 years in that house who has made it feel like a place worth being in, because you see the gap between what is recorded and what is true, and you care about closing it, because you walked in my mother's garden in the morning without my asking you to, and you told me it was designed for walking, and you were right." He paused. He said, "Because I have stood outside closed doors to make sure you had light to walk back by, and I would like to stop doing it indirectly." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about it completely, the way she thought about everything that mattered, with full attention and no shortcuts. She thought about the cold parlor and the 7 years and the ledgers in their brown cloth covers, and she thought about the walled garden path and the discrepancy analysis and the feeling of being in a room that had actually looked at her. She thought about what it would mean to say yes, and she thought about what it would mean to say no, and she arrived at the answer with the same clarity she arrived at every answer when the figures were complete and the cross-references were confirmed. She said, "Yes." He looked at her as though she were still speaking. Then he said, "Considered?" "Completely," she said. He offered his hand, bare, in the lamplight. She took it. They were married in January at the church on the Aaronmore estate, in a ceremony attended by the household staff and Mrs. Crane and Jane, the housemaid, and Edward Finch, who came from London on the post road despite the gout, and stood in the front pew with his wool dressing gown under his overcoat, which Penelope did not comment on. The Duke wore a dark tailcoat and no ornamentation. She wore a dress that was not dark blue. She had bought a new one, deliberately, in a pale gray that she liked and that he had said, when he saw it, suited her precisely. She had also, in the month between the assembly and the wedding, completed the Yorkshire account reconstruction, the final figure for recoverable margin, from the pre-tenure agreement review, the 1814 discrepancy, and 3 smaller corrections she had identified in the final weeks of analysis, was £460 annually, beginning the following quarter. She had written it in the final page of the new ledger, signed it, and presented it to the Duke with the annotation portfolio and a clean copy for the solicitor's files. He had read it and set it down, and looked at her and said nothing, which was, she had come to understand, his highest expression of satisfaction. The life they built was not a simple one, because neither of them was simple, and the estate was large, and the accounts required continuous attention, and the world did not stop arranging itself in ways that required precision to navigate. But it was a life that used what she actually was, in full, every day, and that was something she had been waiting for long enough that she received it carefully and did not take it for granted. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1819, and they named her Eleanor, which had been his mother's name, and she had from her first weeks of life a focused quality of attention, looking at things with her whole face, tracking movement with the patience of someone who intends to understand it, that Penelope recognized, and that made the Duke look at his child with an expression she thought might break him open if he let it, which he sometimes did, alone in the evenings in the nursery when he thought no one was watching, and which she saw because she was always watching, because it was her habit, and also because she could not look away. The annotated accounts system she had developed, the cross-referencing method, the summary page format, the tenancy integration approach, was adopted by 2 neighboring estates by the spring of 1820, one of whose estate stewards had attended the Chalcot meeting and had written to ask, with some embarrassment, whether she would be willing to advise on implementation. She had written back a precise and generous letter outlining the method and its rationale, and had enclosed a clean copy of the summary page template, and had said she was available for consultation at Aaronmore Hall on any Thursday afternoon. She charged a consulting fee. She invested it in the estate's discretionary fund and noted it in the ledger under professional services, outgoing, which she found satisfying in the particular way that only exact categories of record can be satisfying. She was in the estate office on a Thursday afternoon in the spring of 1820, completing the quarterly reconciliation, when she heard Eleanor escape from the nursery again. The small, rapid footsteps on the stone corridor floor were unmistakable, and the Duke's voice, low and briefly surprised, and then Eleanor's delighted noise, and then silence. She continued the reconciliation. A few minutes later, the door opened and Alexander came in with Eleanor on his arm, both of them carrying the same expression of mild, guilty satisfaction, which was becoming a pattern she found she had no interest in correcting. She did not look up from the ledger. She said, "The quarterly figures are complete. The margin recovery this quarter is £63 above last year's equivalent." He said, "Excellent." He set Eleanor carefully in the chair beside the writing table, which Eleanor accepted with the patience of someone who has been carried to exactly the right place. Penelope put down her pen. She looked at her daughter in the chair and her husband standing beside it with his hand on Eleanor's back and the spring light coming through the window across all of them, and she felt the thing that she had no word for and had stopped needing one, the settled, precise, complete feeling of a life that fit the shape of the person living it. Eleanor reached for the pen. Penelope gave it to her. Alexander watched them both with the quiet attention of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for and has every intention of keeping it. She knew he was watching. She had always known when he was watching. She picked up the new page and began the next column, and outside the window the walled garden was coming into its spring and the path curved in the way her mother-in-law had designed it, for walking in the mornings, and the roses were beginning.